Okay, welcome everyone. My name is David Petrasek. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I'm senior editor at Open Global Rights. Today, this webinar will address the topic of sexual violence against men and boys in conflict. I'll explain briefly the format, introduce our panelists, and then we'll get right into the issues. The way we'll run this is that I'll have a discussion with the panelists for about 30 minutes, a kind of question and answer about the issue. And then for another 30 minutes, we'll take questions from those of you who've signed up to follow the webinar. To put a question, if you just go down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A. You just type in your question, and I'll put those questions to the panelists in the second half of the webinar in the second 30 minutes. The webinar is live streamed on Facebook, and we're also recording it, and it'll be up on our website and perhaps other websites afterwards for, we hope, wider distribution dissemination. I'll briefly now introduce the two panelists. You have their full biographies, so I'll just say a few words about them. Charulata Hogg, welcome Charu. She is the founder and director of the All Survivors Project. She's a human rights researcher and activist of long standing. She has experience working in conflict, doing research on human rights abuses in conflict in Sri Lanka, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Nepal, and elsewhere. We're very pleased that you're with us today, Charu. Our second panelist is Sophie Sutrich. Sophie leads work at the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, on sexual violence in conflict. She has a decade of humanitarian experience in the field, including in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Welcome, Sophie. Very pleased that you're with us today. The topic that we'll be addressing, sexual violence against men and boys in conflict, how to introduce this? I think I'd say that the fact of sexual-related conflict violence isn't new. We've for over 2 decades now or longer, we've been reading reports about sexual violence in conflict in Bosnia and Rwanda and the DRC. Perhaps those are the most well-known cases, but in many other situations as well. But this reporting has rarely reported on sexual violence in conflict against men and boys. The bulk of the reporting, and in fact the bulk of the response to this, which frankly has been inadequate, but there has been some response by the international community, but the bulk of the response has been directed at the sexual violence suffered by women and girls. Only recently have we seen reports emerging about the sexual violence experienced by men and boys in conflict situations. And today we want to discuss why that's so, what's the nature of this violence, and what can be done about it to put an end to it. The topic has, as some have described it, has been at the margins of the broader debate about sexual violence in conflict. And if we see this webinar as an attempt to, if you like, bring it, to help and assist to bring it out of the margins and into the mainstream discussion about this pressing problem. I think I'll start by asking you, Sophie. It's a difficult and sensitive topic. But what do we mean, to understand it better, what do we mean when we speak about sexual violence against men and boys? Can you describe the range of abusive behavior that this heading would include?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having us also focusing on the subject. Like you said, it is an issue that definitely needs also additional attention. And the question here is, how can we ensure that everybody receives the attention that they deserve? In terms of specifically sexual violence against men and boys, we have been focusing on sexual violence in conflict situations in particular, including also in detention. So let's say that for us as an institution, it is not necessarily something new to focus on men and boys as well. And while that's not the only case, it's also linked to our presence in detention, where we have been very much aware of this phenomenon. So while it might be true that there has been overall a larger focus also on women and girls, which is, as you said, still very much needed because gaps continue to be there. To us, it's not really new. So you asked about what do we mean by that as well, right? Sexual violence.
Yes, the kind of the range of abusive behaviors we're talking about.
Yeah, so there is of course multiple motivations also why people commit sexual violence. If we stick a little bit to the conflict settings, and I do that also because this is our specific focus as an organization, because that this webinar also focuses on that. But I also want to say that of course we cannot use this, we cannot address this in a vacuum, just in conflict. We always have to keep in mind that it is a phenomenon that goes from peacetime to conflict, and that there are dynamics that are always interlinked. So within conflict, often what we talk about is using also sexual violence as a tactic of war, which means that it is something that that is actually perpetrated purposefully with the aim to actually gain military advantage, right? So this can be the case, of course, for women, men, boys, and girls alike, because the way sexual violence is committed is always based on also, we always say it's a gendered phenomenon. So the way it is committed is often using specific understandings of gender norms in order to basically cause the highest possible harm on the victim. So we see this both for women and girls, but also for men and boys. And often it is similar assumptions about gender roles that are somehow at the basis of that. Now, in terms of the different forms, we're sometimes, if I may generalize, we're sometimes directly thinking of rape, and again, this is true also for women. So when we think of men and boys, we think of anal rape, whereas actually the types of sexual violence that are perpetrated go very much beyond that, and we need to also continue to raise awareness of the different types of sexual violence that can be committed, also for the responders, but of course also the victims and survivors, to be aware of what constitutes sexual violence. And I think specifically for men and boys, also what is a huge part as well is also witnessing of sexual violence, sometimes of family members, or threatened witnessing of violence perpetrated against family members. Forced perpetration of sexual violence, actually, which we have seen as well. So where actually men are forced to commit sexual violence and thereby actually become victim survivors of sexual violence themselves. It can also include mutilation of genital organs, which can be part of ill treatment, forced anal examinations, forced nudity. So there's a much broader range of types of sexual violence than just rape.
Okay, thank you for that. You mentioned motivations, and I'm going to come back to that point later. Perhaps turning to you, Charu. You've done research specifically on this issue in Syria and Afghanistan, and perhaps and elsewhere. How prevalent is it? Do you have any sense of how widespread this form of violence is?
I think the first thing to be said at the outset, David, is that we know very little about it. Research is very limited, and our understanding is very limited. So, for instance, prevalent studies are very scarce, but the existing ones do show a high prevalence, a potentially high prevalence rate of conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys in some specific settings. So we have also collated information from UN and national sources dating back to 1963. And we find that in 22 countries, the UN has documented conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys. Our own research has been conducted in Sri Lanka, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Afghanistan, and in Central African Republic. The Afghanistan research is just at the stage of data collection, so I wouldn't be able to speak very precisely on that. But I think certain issues in the context of conflict are becoming very clear. Firstly, the vulnerability factors. Where are men and boys most vulnerable to sexual victimization? We find that detention, both official and unofficial detention sites, administered by both state and non-state armed groups and forces, are vulnerability sites for sexual victimization. We find that also house searches at checkpoints and in public places, there is a high degree of vulnerability for men and boys. Of course, this vulnerability extends to women and girls as well, but we do find that it's, in the course of house raids, etc., sexual violence is used as a tool to terrorize all populations. In Central African Republic, we found that the tool of sexual violence and rape was used particularly by armed groups in the courses of armed incursions and during armed attacks between different groups. We also can detect a very discernible vulnerability which exists for boys in particular in the context of their recruitment by both armed forces and armed groups, during military conscription or during abduction into paramilitary forces, and sometimes even as a part of an initiation or an integration ritual. We also find perversely, the same vulnerability comes into play when children, boys and girls are being demobilized and are being placed in care situations. We have found a vulnerability of sexual victimization of boys and girls in situations of severe humanitarian need. For instance, in Central African Republic, we have found, and these are well-known cases where foreign troop contributors did exploit extreme vulnerability and needs of boys and girls and men and women, and use them for what was usually termed as survival sex.
Can I just, do you mean then when you say, so where they needed humanitarian assistance, food or medical care, in other words, this was a situation of vulnerability in a camp for setting?
Exactly, or food for that matter, or in the context of migration, forced displacement and migration arising due to armed conflict. A situation that has played itself again and again in countries like Greece, in Italy, in many parts of the world where boys in particular who are unaccompanied and displaced and move out of conflict context find themselves in situations of dire need and therefore are forced into and are raped for sometimes paid money for being raped, and it is a very extractive and exploitative practice. But we find there's a huge vulnerability for boys and girls in these situations. So we also find that in situations of forced displacement during flight, in refugee camps, in host communities, there is a great degree of vulnerability.
You spoke about how there may be particular vulnerabilities for boys and in particular settings, which you gave a very comprehensive list there. But are there other categories of men and boys that may be particularly at risk? And what's the role here of sexual, or what's the sexual orientation and gender identity factor into? Is this a risk increasing factor?
Absolutely, David. I mean, we have many factors which particularly contribute to increasing vulnerability. Disability, age, and sexual orientation and gender identity is definitely an intersectional factor which makes certain groups of people much more vulnerable. This has emerged quite starkly in the course of our research in Syria, in Turkey, and also in Afghanistan, where perpetration of violence and the brutality of violence sometimes is enhanced when a person of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity is the target of the attack. So yes, certainly, that is a cross-cutting factor, that is an intersection factor, and that is something that human rights and humanitarian actors need to fully comprehend and understand.
Okay, thanks, Charu. Sophie, we've had public attention, as I mentioned at the outset, public attention to the issue of gender-based violence, largely understood as violence against women and girls. And as I said again at the beginning, much remains to be done on that problem. But it does seem that violence against men and boys, there's been less attention to it. And if you agree with that, what might explain this relative inattention? Why is this a form of violence that we're only now coming to understand and appreciate its prevalence?
I mean, I think what really is important in this context to mention is that, of course, every victim survivor has the right to be taken seriously, to get the attention that they deserve, right? So for me, it's less of a question of who has been given less attention or more, or who should we focus on now. For me, it's a question of how can we really make sure that everybody gets the attention, and how do we put ourselves in a position to be able to actually respond in a truly impartial manner, right? So it seems, and it links a bit to what Charo was saying about all the different intersectionalities and the different factors of vulnerability. These will always remain certain groups, right? We tend to think in groups, right? We think of women, we think of men, we think of sexual orientation. We have to be able to understand and be aware of all of them, and then apply it in a contextual manner on a needs base, right? So it sounds very easy. It's much more complex than that. But that, I think, is really the answer here, right? And I know that there has been, there is sometimes, you know, in the humanitarian context, a little bit of also apprehension, you know, that if you focus on something else, that other things will get less attention, and we all have to work together to make sure that this is not, that's not what's going to happen. So it should not be a question of should we focus on this or on something else, but it has to be how can we all work together to make sure that we are in this in the position to provide that. And a lot, I think, for in my opinion, a lot in order to get there is really our capacity. Our internal capacity building. So if I think of our own work and our own challenges institutionally to respond to sexual violence for men, women, boys, and girls, I really feel that the better we get in general to respond to it, the better we get to responding to all the different pieces. What I want to say by that is it doesn't cost anything when we train our people to on how to address sexual violence, to ensure that we have the capacity to address sexual violence vis-a-vis all the different vulnerable groups.
Right,
yeah.
Right. But that's very helpful. Thank you. I'm wondering though, is there particular forms of stigma or difficulties that either the victims face or those who are ought to be aware of their problem, humanitarian actors and others who they encounter in conflict zones? Are there is there something blocking the awareness here? And Charo, feel free to come in on this point too, but Sophie, do you feel there are these particular factors or not?
I mean, I think stigma is there. Stigma is there for people across the board. What we did see, and I think Charo can speak to that a lot more into detail, is that it is true that sometimes also for male survivors, it doesn't necessarily, what we would include under sexual violence doesn't necessarily register with that terminology. So that often it's kind of subsumed under ill treatment, or somehow the general narrative is that sexual and gender-based violence is something that happens to women, right? Which is also a narrative that we don't want to continue contributing to, right? So I think this is one element that we have seen. I wouldn't say, I mean, I couldn't say this is the main reason why, but that's one consideration that we have seen, and I think Charo can speak more about that as well.
So, thank you, Sophie. That's very helpful, and I of course agree with what you're saying. But I think adopting there are various levels here, which I think contribute to the invisibilization of certain groups. and marginalization of certain groups. And in these marginalized groups, I would include certainly groups of sexual orientation and gender identity who are victimized. I would include men and boys. And what is the reason for this? I think there are multiple layers. The first is, of course, prevailing gender norms. The ideas of masculinity, which inhibit male survivors from coming forward, and indeed from care providers from opening up the access. So the same biases and prejudices that exist within survivors, within perpetrators, exist within all of us as humanitarians, as human rights activists as well. So I think that contributes to the invisibilization to a certain degree. The second is I would dig a bit deeper into issue of resources, always hugely limited for sexual and gender-based violence response work and prevention work, very, very limited. And obviously, on the basis of what we do know that women and girls are disproportionately affected. So, in a sense, even as an advocate for marginalized groups, I would say that responses have to be proportionate to what we know. We cannot begin to allocate, resources for a group. Of course, it's a catch-22 as well. The less access you have to services, the less survivors will come forward. The less disclosures we have, the less donors will want to put funding into addressing the issue. So it's a bit of a catch-22. But we do know that more women and girls are sexually violated as compared to men and boys. That's a fact.
When you say resources, sorry, go ahead, Sophie.
No, just to jump on that, because it's in general with sexual and gender-based violence, we know that as responders, as humanitarians, we have to be proactive, because it's that catch-22. If we're not proactive, people will not come forward, we will not have cases, and we will not be able to show the need. So I just wanted to stress that, of course, this principle is true in general for all groups of survivors, and we have really tried now already for multiple years to be very open internally and externally to say we have adopted an approach where we no longer need to wait for data, for evidence that proves to us that there is an issue. We work based on the assumption that sexual violence exists, and then we kind of made the commitment to be proactive. And since we're speaking about men and boys, that of course should include that we have entry points that are adequate for men and boys, right? So if humanitarians continue to just think about females, and then as a consequence from the medical side, the only entry point that is envisaged in the program is in the maternities, right? So we have somehow already excluded to a certain extent male survivors, or made it a lot more difficult for them to come forward. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, good. Chara, you spoke about gendered notions of masculinity. We've got a better understanding now of the specific gendered nature of violence against women and in conflict, how it's bound up in these assumptions of masculinity that emphasize power and domination. Does this gendered understanding of violence against women and girls help us in understanding sexual violence against men and boys? Or are there specificities? Are there new understandings of the gendered nature of the violence that we need to come to grips with?
Absolutely. I think there are lessons to be learned from the years, decades of advocacy, activism and research that has gone into understanding about sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls and what works for women and girls. However, the motivations are different, and we need to be clear about this. The drivers may be similar, so that the drivers may be to humiliate, maybe to terrorize, maybe to sort of emasculate or demasculate an individual, a man in this case. But the motivations in the case of women are multiple and complex. Women already suffer from multiple layers and intersectional layers of gender inequality. So the position they are in when they are victimized is quite different to what men find themselves in when they're victimized. It makes the advocacy and the interventions for women easier in a way to understand, because we already have an understanding that gender inequality has put them in that vulnerable situation. It makes it harder for us to understand how to respond to men and boys. And therefore, from our perspective, we do need the evidence, we need the understanding, we do need to, we do not advocate for a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. And we're very clear that a one-size-fits-all approach can end up doing much more harm to the vulnerable population, including men and boys, and also potentially erode the space, the safe spaces for women and girls. So whilst we advocate for more resources, more capacity to respond to all survivors, we think a nuance is very important in terms of understanding the peculiarities, the significance and the differences that lie between the vulnerability of the two genders, and including of those who are attacked because of their diverse stogie.
Okay, I think that it's very helpful. Thank you. We're going to start taking questions. So if you have questions, please type them in the box. I have a couple more questions for the panelists first, but go ahead and start typing your questions if you have them. What are the biggest obstacles to stopping this form of violence? Is it, the lack of accountability, that perpetrators get away with this and aren't held to account? Is it the lack of awareness? Is it the fact that people who you called them responders, the humanitarians and others who are present in conflict, are insufficiently trained or don't have the resources? A combination of all of these. If you had to point, and the question is to both of you, if you had to point to just one thing or one or two things, what would you emphasize in terms of putting an end to this form of violence?
Sophie, do you want to go?
Yeah, it's difficult because I would definitely say it's all of these things and a combination of these as well. I think there has been, I think we're very much far away from addressing the issue in an adequate way. And by this, I mean response and definitely prevention. I think at the same time, it is kind of clear. We know what could be done. And that doesn't mean that we don't need to continue better understanding the phenomenon and keep working on that as well. But I think as an international community, there is a clear understanding on all the different levels of steps that can be taken. And a lot of commitments have actually been made. So by the humanitarians, by states who continue actually carrying the main responsibility for both prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence. Since we speak about stopping, right, I will maybe speak more about the part of prevention. From the state level, there is a clear gap in some contexts also to also adapt further the domestic laws to international standards. That is one step that can be taken. Training of armed forces, of police forces, of detention authorities is a huge issue as well. At the basis of all of this is, of course, political commitment, and also before the political commitment, really the willingness to speak about the subject. So I feel that at that level, there is a bit of a progress that we see. I see more states speaking very openly about the subject, about what they are planning to do or committing to do, also where they would appreciate support. So I think there is an opening at the state level, but also at the local level, grassroots level, and also international humanitarian organizations. I think there still is potential and room to better understand also social norms around. We spoke a little bit about the gendered phenomenon, how sexual and gender-based violence is linked, rooted in gender norms, to become more effective at really influencing social norms as well. Like from the perspective of the ICRC, we have been traditionally, historically, very much focused on the law, right? So this is our main mandate. We speak about international humanitarian law, the laws of war. What are the laws? Who is supposed to adhere to them? And at the same time, we are becoming more open to combine this, the focus on the law, but also with what actually brings people to change their behavior and in a consequence not violate the laws anymore. So we need to continue better understanding also the social norms around that phenomenon.
Okay, Charo, do you
Yes.
want to respond as well?
Okay.
I know it's a difficult question, but I'm just trying to get a sense of prioritization.
Yes. I mean, look, I would argue that actually criminalization and strengthening the legal framework is at the heart of it. We have 62 countries today which do not criminalize male rape. We have 67 countries which criminalize sexual violence, which criminalize same-sex, consensual same-sex conduct. So, there is already a barrier in terms of accountability. And by accountability, I don't mean criminal justice accountability, but I mean about, the prevention side as well. I think the work on sensitization is so limited, it's highly resource intensive, it is highly context specific. And I think as international actors, there may well be a good understanding, but it is not necessarily being translated into solutions which would be applicable at the community and in a context-sensitive manner. So to give you an example, you have a country like Central African Republic, which has seen years of, a very fractured political system, years of conflict, a massive scale of sexual violence against women and girls, but also against men and boys. An issue of resourcing capacity, national prosecutions, the absence of training for justice actors, the complete lack of access to communities, because 60% of the country is controlled by armed groups. So you have very real issues in contexts, in these context of severe humanitarian settings, which are barriers. So I think, yes, at the policy level, we see a high level of commitment. In Oslo, we saw, the pledging towards addressing sexual violence going up. We recently had a really...
Sorry, could you clarify what Oslo was?
So in the Norwegian government recently hosted in May an international conference on a pledging conference on addressing sexual and gender-based violence, where many countries and NGOs and communities from various countries came together to really strengthen their resolve, and it was a very heartening moment. But that resolve, we need to see trickle down to the communities where the prevention work needs to happen.
Okay, great. We've got some really good questions coming in, so I'm going to go to the questions. The first one, our participant is asking for a point of clarification. There's the perception that the panelists are making a distinction between sexual violence and sexual and gender-based violence. Are they arguing that sexual violence against men and boys in conflict settings is not a form of gender-based violence? Do either of you want to reply to that?
I'm going to jump into that. The way All Survivors Project frames our work is that we look at conflict-related sexual violence, which is and we follow a definition which is put forward by the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in 2016. And we look at causal and other links or topical links to temporal links to the conflict. However, it can be definitely argued in a conceptual framing that sexual violence against men is also gender-based violence, because it is at the heart of it gendered in the way for the drivers, and the way it is also manifest, and as the way it is used to terrorize and humiliate and control, very similar to the manner it is used against women and girls as well. I would also argue that gender-based violence against men occurs in many different ways, in which boys in many countries are targeted specifically to be recruited as soldiers, as or being involved in armed conflict, and therefore there was a gendered nature to that violence against children as well. In the same way, we see extrajudicial executions in which men are specifically targeted. So these are also different forms of gender-based violence which apply to men and boys as well.
Sophie, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we do definitely define sexual violence being a form of gender-based violence. The reason why I sometimes use sexual violence specifically is actually that we do specifically address sexual violence as the International Committee of the Red Cross, because that is where we're coming from in terms of our mandate. But having said that, there's of course other forms of gender-based violence, and we always have to see them together. And also in terms of our mandate, we focus specifically on sexual violence when we speak about prevention and our dialogue that we have with authorities, states, etc. But at the same time, from a response perspective, if we think about health services, for example, obviously we would not distinguish or between victims of sexual violence or of other forms of gender-based violence. So I hope this clarifies a little bit.
Okay, I think it does. Yes. Okay, good. We have it's a comment really from Pinina Kansim. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This participant says, in Uganda, my research shows that the cultural gender norms that are entrenched in hegemonic masculinity are the biggest obstacles to addressing conflict-related sexual violence against men. Do either of you want to comment on that?
I think that's absolutely right, that there is, as I mentioned before, the prejudices that exist within the community of service providers often become the deterrents and the barriers to care provision. So that's one end of it. In terms of perpetration, for sure, the fact that sexual violence is used as a tool of terror to humiliate and degrade and control ensures, and the very sexual nature of it also becomes a silencer of it, because generally the sexuality is considered sort of very private and is not something that people would want to, and makes people very vulnerable in a particular way that other forms of violation do not. So much so that we've had in our research cases where men would prefer to identify themselves as victims of torture, and within the use of words like torture, humiliation would disguise the sexual nature of the crime that was committed against them. So certainly, gendered norms do play a very big role.
This is, thank you, Charo. It points directly to another question which has come up from Doreen Lanta, who's working for the Women's Initiatives for Gender Justice, and she refers to their Call It What It Is campaign, which aims to give guiding principles on what makes violence sexual based on the survivor's point of view. And she says this could vary between men and boys and women and girls. And the particular question is, would you be able to tell me more about the male's experience? Based on your experience, is it important to recognize that the harm suffered by some men is sexual? In other words, to label it as sexual as opposed to, or in addition to, labeling it as torture, ill treatment.
For us, it's very important to call it what it is, because if you do not identify the sexual nature of the crime, you fail to respond to it from the perspective of medical and mental health service provision, the damage that the sexual nature of the crime has caused. For instance, genital trauma, issues relating to incontinence, issues relating to infections, STDs, long-term consequences of sexualized violence would not be addressed or would not be attended to if the distinction wasn't made to identify quite explicitly that the survivor victim had suffered this form of victimization. However, it is not necessary, and it is only up to the survivor to decide how they want to disclose and to whom they want to disclose and how they want their violation to be identified. It is not for us to determine that, but it is important for the caregiver and the care provider to understand the different levels of victimization that the person has suffered.
Based on your experience, though, Charu, interviewing people who've suffered this form of abuse, is there a reluctance to describe it as sexual?
Absolutely. I have interviewed, particularly in the context of Sri Lanka, multiple survivors of sexual violence, both women and men. And I found in that very specific, very small group of people, I found that women found it easier to describe the sexual nature of their crime, of the crime that they had suffered, as compared to men.
Yeah, I can only agree with that. I think, like Charu said, the most important part is that the survivor defines how they want to refer to it. The most important part is that they actually are in a position to access the care that they need and want. But also, I think it is important to call it what it is at the general level, because if we can't call it what it is, we also pass a message that we cannot talk about it, and we perpetuate this the stigma or the sensitivity that actually keeps preventing people from coming forward. So I think definitely we have to also contribute to calling it what it is, to make it easier. And I did also link to the other question. I also felt it is often easier to speak about it if it falls under a separate category of violence, right? It comes out. There seems to be less of an obstacle.
Yeah, ill treatment or torture, you mean?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
This is your experience with victims.
This has been our experience, definitely. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I have another question from Chintan Modi in India. The question here is about sexual violence against men and boys perpetrated by humanitarian workers. Makes reference to a recent case UN Women had to deal with. Is this a particular problem? The case in the Central African Republic was referred to earlier. I mean, that one is fairly widely known, but is this a particular problem, humanitarian workers being responsible for perpetrating this form of violence against men and boys?
I mean, these cases are really, they reflect something that is against everything that we stand for, right? Because people are expected to receive support. People are sometimes depending on assistance provided by humanitarians. So such cases, we need to do obviously everything that is in our power to prevent these from happening, and also following up should they happen. So I can only say that over the last few years, this has certainly been given a lot of attention, and including within the ICRC, and a lot of attention and also resources in terms of being in a better position to prevent and also respond to such cases.
Charu?
David, I would say that yes, preventing sexual exploitation and abuse has become a big issue for the UN in particular, given all the cases of abuse that have been uncovered. It became a priority for the Secretary General, and we've seen a host and a flurry of activity happening in this context. But I think there is no shortcut to oversight and mechanisms that need to be put into place. Selection of peacekeepers and troop contributors, from the host countries. We've seen a real gap in terms of, commitments at the highest level and their implementation at the national level, because obviously there's a need. I'm picking up on a very small issue, which is of foreign troop contributors, because there have been numerous instances of abuse, particularly of vulnerable populations, by foreign troop contributors in situations of severe humanitarian crisis. And now, why does this continue to happen? I think we have to get to the heart of the need for foreign troop contributors and how the standards are not really followed in terms of the training, the scrutiny that contributing countries are put through, the troops are put through, and finally the question of accountability. I mean, it's a genuine and an important question to address, that what happened in the case of the Sangaris in Central African Republic was symbolic on so many levels. Here was a case of, where the testimonies of these young boys was repeatedly taken by numerous humanitarian workers and by the French police, and yet, the cases were dismissed in France for lack of evidence. The question.
Sorry, just to clarify, these are allegations against French peacekeeping troops. Right,
yes.
right.
Well, the Operation Sangaris were a group of different nationalities, Ecuadorian, and of various, and the French were some of them. Some of the cases against the French troop contributors went to the French national courts, but were dismissed for lack of evidence. So I think this has really brought home to the point that what is the jurisdiction within which international troop contributors and humanitarians are held accountable, and will there ever be justice for the crimes that are perpetrated in humanitarian settings, because finally they will fall within the jurisdiction of their own national authorities and will take action.
Right. Sophie, you work for the world's most well-known humanitarian organization, but you interact with many humanitarian organizations, and Charu, as do you in your work. And I'm just wondering, a question to both of you to follow up on the question that our panelists put. Do you think because we spoke about prevention, do you think the training programs that are in place for humanitarians who are deployed to the field are adequate to ensure they're fully aware of this problem, not only of their own responsibilities and accountabilities, but in relation to reporting on it when they see it being done by others? I ask this question because some of the cases in the past which have come to light about humanitarian organizations and workers with them engaging in these forms of violence have pointed to this kind of culture of silence, which is present or has been present in some humanitarian organizations in the field. Do you think that's been addressed? Do you have a sense of that from your experience up close with these organizations?
I mean, I'm not an expert on that specific subject, and I can't speak for other organizations. What I did certainly see is that there has been progress. At the same time, it's an ongoing challenge, and it's not something I feel where because you also say it's also built in cultural settings where we can say we have now addressed it, right? I don't think we have reached this point, and I don't think we will reach this point where we say now we have adequately addressed it, and we're done, and we can relax. No, I think this is an ongoing effort that has been certainly intensified and will also have to continue, no question about it.
Charo, did you want to comment on that?
I think much more needs to be done at the national level. I do believe that international protocols are sound, but their application remains quite limited. So, for instance, in terms of oversight mechanisms, we do have a real problem in terms of how they are applied, what sort of training is imparted, whether there is a chain of command is followed in terms of reporting. We've had a case in Afghanistan, not so distant past, where cases of abuse were documented by NATO forces did not go up the chain of command and caused a real source of an inquiry at the Department of Defense in the US. So I think unless stronger measures are put in place in terms of the reporting of cases, whether they are perpetrated by the humanitarians or they are witnessed by the humanitarians, we will not have decisive action.
Okay. One of the we've talked a lot about the problem, and we've pointed to, in general, particular solutions or responses that are needed. But are either of you aware of a specific initiative, an example you could give us that you'd point to say, this is something that shows what can be done in either in one of the conflict settings or perhaps that you've heard about. In other words, I'm looking for some sense of some example of an effective response in one of these conflict settings, or is it really just that it's too early to say because this issue is really just now coming onto the agenda?
Well, I think there are examples. From our perspective, we do certainly think that there have to be a lot more. We're currently to this end engaged in a specific research project or kind of operational research or study, where we're actually trying to answer that question ourselves. So we are looking at what is good practice or best practice across the globe, trying to understand also better how what are our own internal challenges in being more inclusive to all survivors, and exactly the objective of this study is really for us to understand better as an organization what are the specific recommendations or measures that we can take to do so. So we are looking at all these different examples, and we are reading about them as also from other organizations. We have here and there, of course, also our own experience, but we're not yet there where we can actually really present the results of this, which is a pity. So in a few months' time, we will be able to say more, but I'm sure Charo has some examples from her side.
So, David, in terms of, good practice, I think I agree with Sophie, too early to talk about good practice, but promising practices and are certainly emerging all over the world in different sites. But we would, caution against advocating for any particular response as being the holistic and complete response, because it is very context specific. It needs to be assessed and evaluated for other settings. So that's one piece that I think needs to be put out there. The second issue is about, is something that responds to the wishes and the needs of survivors? Is that what they want? I think that's at the heart of it. Any response has to be survivor-centered, has to be developed in a survivor participatory manner. On this, one really fantastic project that I would like to highlight is the refugee law project runs a Men of Hope. It's a sub-organization within the refugee law project in Uganda. And it's a survivor-led approach which looks at issues as diverse as access to mental health care, transitional justice. And I think that is really inspirational. And as those of us who are working on these issues, should really look at these issues to teach us about, because it is not for us to decide. It is for survivors to decide. It is a privilege for us to work with them.
Okay, thanks. And one of our participants, again, Chintan Modi in India, has pointed out very helpfully that the Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society has recently released a report on torture in Jammu and in Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir, and which mentions, it does report on instances of violence experienced by men, including rape and sodomy, electrocution of genitals, etc. So an example of groups very much at the front line that are now reporting on this. I have time for, there's one more question here that's come up, and I'll read it out to you. It's the question is this: we spoke briefly about the connection of hegemonic masculinity and sexual violence. However, the participant is saying, however, I would argue that hegemonic masculinity is not a monolithic framework. How is your work addressing and understanding diverse perceptions and manifestations of masculinities in various contexts, the home, community, public spaces? Do either of you want to respond to that?
David, I would go back to the issue of how scarce our understanding is about male victimization, how few studies exist, how little literature exists. We have recently, with London School for Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, conducted an exhaustive, what we thought was an exhaustive literature review of understanding medical and mental health interventions that exist for male survivors. The idea was really to see what was happening and how much of it was being written up. We have found 22 pieces of work, both in academia and grey literature, which talk about this issue. That just tells you. And that's on one aspect. The issue of gender norms and masculinity, again, remains similarly unexplored and uninvestigated. So I would say, as a research organization, we are the first to admit that we are at the tip of the iceberg in terms of really beginning to understand, the different forms, the different manifestations, the need for responses and the kind of variations in responses, the context, specificity. So yes, we know very little, unfortunately.
Do you see, Chow, just to follow up on that, do you see in the academic community an increased interest and attention to this?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there is greater interest. I think ultimately it will also depend on, particularly for PhD research, it will depend on grants, on funding, on interest by donors as well to really begin to investigate this issue. Research conventionally in social sciences is underfunded, as we all know, and I think we need to begin to also explore linkages with public health, with conflict resolution and conflict mitigation. We need to explore all these intersectional linkages to understand and to put in more resources into understanding this phenomenon, because without which I think we will be left with a very one-dimensional view of what happens.
Okay, thanks very much. Sophie, did you have a comment on that, this notion of the need to pay attention to diverse perceptions and not be trapped by a monolithic understanding of hegemonic?
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. There's not one definition or understanding of masculinities, and the need for research is there. It's something that it's another topic that we're very much interested, linked to what I mentioned earlier, in better understanding also social norms and to bring about behavioral change. So with all of that and with the research that is hopefully going to be increasing, we have to be very careful not to have a simplistic reading also of specific outcomes, and not to simplify very complex experiences that are also different from person to person. But we have to work on our ability to actually address these in a tailored way that is truly responding to what a specific survivor actually feels and identifies with.
Okay, good. We've run out of time, so I just want to ask our two panelists whether either of you want to make a very quick last word, last point, something you think wasn't addressed or something you want to emphasize going forward.
Yeah, one quick thing, David, would be important to, I think, stress that attention on marginalized groups such as men and boys and those who are made vulnerable because of their sexual orientation and gender identity is not an either or in terms of the attention to women and girls. It never should be. It should never be addressed as that. It is a basic human rights issue which affects all human beings, and every human being should have access to care and to reparation.
Thank you. Sophie?
Yeah, I just wanted also to highlight the importance to continue the discussion on the subject. I think it's really a great initiative that you chose that subject. There is still a lot to be done in terms of awareness. And I think all the different initiatives, and also we can see that there's interest from the audience, all of this together, I think will actually also help our response, and hopefully it will break the stigma in a little bit and make it just an easier topic to address and prevent.
Okay, terrific. I want to thank both of our panelists. This was a really interesting discussion, and I want to thank you for highlighting this issue and for pointing to the need for it to get more attention and for us to continue to discuss and address it. And especially the plea you made around to states to act on legislation, but also in terms of donor states and the UN in terms of resources to this issue. I think these are all really important. It's been a really interesting discussion. So thank you. Thank you to our participants very much for joining us for the discussion today. I would just say, as you exit, to the participants, as you exit the screen, you'll be prompted to take a survey. It doesn't take more than a minute. It just helps us. The survey just asks you some questions about how this format worked or didn't work for you, and it helps us refine it as we go forward. So please do the survey if you can. Thank you very much to everyone who's taken part today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.